Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. That worked. So please we're going to get started. So please take a seat. So welcome to the Architecture Fall Lecture Series. So this is a very special lecture because this is the David Dillon Memorial Lecture. So I'll just tell a little bit about David, and I think we're going to learn more in tonight's lecture. But David is probably best known. Was a really well-known architectural writer. So he wrote for various professional journals. He wrote books. He wrote popular press pieces. And I knew him, or most of us knew him, as the architecture critic for the Dallas Morning News. So the Dallas Morning News was one of those newspapers that had really continued to invest in architectural criticism. And David was one of the most well-known critics when he worked for that newspaper. So I often tell the story about moving to Amherst, Massachusetts, and then learning that David Dillon lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I couldn't figure out how that was possible. But it was possible. So we got him involved in our architecture department. So for several years, he taught junior year writing. He taught architectural history. He was a critic on thesis reviews. I'm missing some of the coursework, but he was a very valued colleague. So when he passed away, the Dillon family and a lot of friends, many of whom are here today, got together and we created this endowment to really support an annual David Dillon Memorial Lecture that will keep advancing his love of architectural writing. So, and actually, if it's okay, I'm going to introduce Sally and Christopher, who are here today. So Sally and Christopher Dillon, and really to thank you for your support and to thank you for sharing David with us for those really meaningful years. So it's a special honor to welcome today's lecturer, who's Kate Holliday, who teaches at the University of Texas at Arlington. But specifically, she is the founding director of the David Dillon Center at Center of Texas Architecture, which is really based at UT Arlington. So Kate grew up in New Orleans and went to high school in New Orleans. I just found that out. But then she migrated to area code 413, where she earned her undergraduate degree in art history and environmental studies at Williams College, just down the road. Then back to the south, to the Gulf States, where she earned a master's degree at UT Austin. She worked back to New Orleans, where she worked at the Historic New Orleans Collection. And then she earned her PhD at UT Austin. So her research and teaching focus on the built environment in American cities, focus on most recently on the post-war dynamics of Texas. So The Open-Ended City, David Dillon on Texas Architecture, is her newest book. It came out just this year, and I understand you're going to talk about that. So I won't tell everyone about that. So she's also working on this one I find particularly fascinating. She's also at work on Telephone City, Architecture and the Rise and Fall of the Bell Monopoly, a book that exposes the relationship between architecture, infrastructure, and technology in the evolution of telephone buildings across the U.S. So please join me in welcoming Kate Holliday.
Thank you. So thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Am I able to? No? The other microphone? I have this one. Let's see if is that better? Yeah. Better? Okay. If it goes off, wave at me. Thank you all very much for having me. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to Julie for handling all the mechanics. And I always say, I talk about the subject of Texas architecture and the things that we do in the Dillon Center quite a bit. But it's always most meaningful to me when people who knew David were there. So I also especially want to thank Sally for all her support across the years since we founded the center at UT Arlington in 2011. It's the toughest audience, but also the best audience. So thank you all for being here. And what I want to talk about today is the book did just come out, and it is the Open-Ended City. This is a quote from David's writing, when he was writing about highways and freeways in Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas. And the landscape of Dallas-Fort Worth is defined by a number of interstate highways in which you go speeding down the highway, supposedly at 70 miles an hour, but probably more like 90 or 95, depending on really what your mood is. And this phrase of the open-ended city was meant to really capture the more positive aspects of what it means to have highways open to you, in which you can get from one place to another and there's nothing there to stop you. Of course, imagining that there's no traffic in your way. But this open-ended city idea also really referred to the idea that the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth and other Sun Belt cities like Miami or Nashville or Atlanta or Phoenix, these are cities that aren't finished yet. These are cities that are still in a state of becoming. They have no fixed form, there's no really fixed identity, and these open-ended cities are ones in which the things that happen every day are happening fast and continuing to evolve really what the urban landscape looks like. And to me, this is a particularly appealing theme in the work that I was putting together in the course of putting together the open-ended city. And the open-ended city, just to put it in a nutshell, this is a collection of articles that David wrote for the Dallas Morning News during the 25 years that he worked there full-time between 1981 and 2006. In that 25 years, he wrote more than 1,000 articles for the newspaper. It's really incredible how prolific he was as a writer, and the writing is all good. Right? So the task of actually whittling this down to something manageable in the context of a book, and it's about 67 articles altogether, was a really huge task, but it was also one in which I learned an enormous amount about writing, an enormous amount about Dallas and Fort Worth, and about Texas in general, and what it means to really write about architecture and write about cities. So it was a really wonderful project for me to work on. What I want to talk about today, though, is what is the point of the book? It's a collection of David's articles from the Dallas Morning News, but in a few ways, there are really two things that I want to think about. And the first of these is that the book is about David's writing. And I always say that I did not know David. I never met him. So there are many of you in this room who did know him. And I got to know David through his writing, through those 1,000 articles, through the books, through the articles in the magazines. And this is a portrait of David in his favorite building in Dallas, the Nasher Sculpture Center. And getting to know someone through sifting through and trying to figure out what the ideas were, learning the vocabulary, learning the kind of bon mot and the expressions that were typical of him was something that was very important in that process. The other thing that the book is about, though, is actually Dallas. And it's about the place that he wrote about for that 25 years for the Dallas Morning News. And I'm showing you here a map of Dallas-Fort Worth in 1959. And I'm showing you this older map because it's only gotten bigger since then. And this one suggests what's really interesting about Dallas is this kind of polynucleated relationship with Fort Worth, where you've got Dallas in the node on the right, and then Fort Worth in the node on the left. And these two cities that in their own right are the 6th and the 14th largest cities in the country, and then put them together, and it's truly this kind of enormous complex system of interconnected nodes and places. It's a really complicated place. I live in Fort Worth. I've lived there about 12 years now. I'm constantly sending my students out to go do projects on things because I don't get it. It's like too big. Saying, please go find all of these crazy places all over Dallas and Fort Worth, and let's try to figure it out together and figure out this puzzle and how it works. And so this project, as much as it was about David and his writing, it's also about the place itself, and it's about Dallas-Fort Worth. One of the other things that I think is important, and the reason that I was able to get someone a publisher to work with me on this, is that ultimately the book is also about the power of writing about architecture. And a lot of you are architecture students, and I know my students are architecture students, and every time I ask them to write, they like pull their hair out. They're like, I'm not here to learn to write. I hate it. I want to make buildings. But we have lots of good conversations about the power of writing to express architectural ideas and to persuade people that the things that you want to design should be built, right? And the power of writing about architecture is the power to persuade the public, to educate the public. And I have this quote here from an article from 2008, that educating the public is important because it tells them, the public about its rights and design matters, because in the end, architecture's biggest ally is a concerned public, and its most powerful weapon is the ability to arouse public opinion in the service of good design. Okay? And that writing in the service of good design is also what this book is about. bringing together 25 years of writing about Texas and making a case for why good design matters to these particular places and why we need more of it. So in a way, this is an interesting project, right? Most architecture critics anthologize their own work. Ada Louise Huxtable produced book after book after book after book of her own writing, and I'm showing you just 3 of them here. The best title, from my opinion, is always Kicked a Building Lately. That's my favorite. Paul Goldberger has an endless stream of his own work that he anthologizes himself, collections from the New York Times, the New Yorker. Blair Kamen from Chicago. The Tribune also has anthologized his own work into 2 books. I believe Inga Saffron just announced that she is now anthologizing for the first time her own work, writing about Philadelphia. Right? So critics tend to edit their own work and pick their own articles. And I'm the first to admit that as a historian, collecting the work of a critic is kind of a different project than a lot of the other critics. It's a little bit more like these collections, which are historians looking back at critics, American architecture and other writings, a collection of Montgomery Schuyler's writing from the late 19th century. The other example of Mariana Griswold van Rensselaer's work, collected in accent as well as broad effects. But these books also have a little bit of a difference in that there's about 100 years separating the historian from the work that they're actually editing and anthologizing. So for me, looking back about 25 years and beginning to anthologize was a little bit of a different project, and one that was also interesting because of the changes that have happened in journalism and the changes that have happened in the way that we read the news. How many of you here actually read a paper newspaper? Like a few, like very few, right? How many of you read any kind of newspaper online at all? Right, and how many of you don't read any newspaper? And it's fine, you can say you don't read the newspaper. It's totally fine, right? So I think this is one of the things that has happened, though, in the past 25 to 30 years, is how we consume the news and whether we consume the news is radically shifted. And that's very much the case at the Dallas Morning News. Again, David was there between 1981 and 2006 when he took a buyout. And the Dallas Morning News has continued to downsize and downsize and downsize. There was just another one just a few months ago in which more people were laid off from the newsroom. And in the process of that downsizing, it also is the case that all of those photographs and illustrations that you normally find in the paper newspaper, and I'm showing an example here from the scrapbooks that Sally and her family collected of David's work, and which we now have in the library at the University of Texas at Arlington. Those scrapbooks, actually, as it turns out, are the only record that we have of what these newspaper articles actually looked like as they were published. Because during the downsizing, the Dallas Morning News threw away their photographs and their illustrations from this time period. And so if you want to try to, this is technology. This is like the Dallas Morning News right now. No more. While we're waiting, what actually happened was they digitized the paper. And when they digitized the paper, what they paid for was a digitized version that was text. Text only. No images, no page images, no photographs, no illustrations. And so what I'm showing you here is the same article, right? If I were editing this volume without the benefit of the scrapbooks that the Dillon family donated to UT Arlington, I would be working strictly from this black and white text. And so it was incredibly important and time-consuming to actually go back and look at all of these articles in the scrapbooks and see what the illustrations were, see how important the article actually was based on the way the paper laid it out, based on where it was in the paper, right? And so this is a part of the what we've lost as we've moved to the digital realm. And I cannot say enough how important, if you have a stack of newspapers in a box somewhere, you never know. It could actually be the last thing that we have that shows us what it really looked like. I don't think the Dallas Morning News is the only paper that made this mistake. And there are people there who tell me, no, it's not missing. But none of the editors could find anything that related to the 80s or the 90s. So there's a missing gap in their digitization of coverage. Before 1984, there are page images, but after 1984, they're not. So, very time-consuming and elaborate process of reconstructing this 25 years And along the way, I think one of the things that's also been pretty interesting, and can we get this off of, it's gone into presentation mode now, which I don't think anyone, do that. Okay, no? Is it back? All right, good. The kind of bigger themes that evolved as I read these 1,000 articles from the Dallas Morning News was really about Dallas becoming Dallas. This is, of course, from the opening credits of Dallas, the TV show, which probably, again, there would be like an age gap here. Probably some of you in the room saw the Dallas TV show, some of you didn't. But in 1983, the paper did a survey of people who didn't live in the city of Dallas to try to find out what they thought of when they thought of the city. And they found that there were 3 things that people who didn't live in the city thought of when they heard the word Dallas. Number 1 was this TV show. Number 2 is the Dallas Cowboys. And number 3 was the JFK assassination. Right? And those 3 things were what defined the city of Dallas in the minds of people outside of the city. And this became a huge issue for the city of Dallas in the 80s and 90s and really into the present as it actually deliberately attempts to rebrand itself and reposition itself. And so this is chronicled in this 25 years, this much larger story about planning, architecture, culture, in the ways that it really evolved. And I think this is what makes Texas particularly interesting. And I'm always very aware that people who don't live in Texas maybe don't find Texas as interesting as people who do live in Texas, who find it endlessly fascinating and can talk about Texas for a very, very, very long time. But Texas is interesting because it does provide a kind of microcosm of American history, especially in the post-war years from 1950 to the present. And I'm showing you here, I think, what is the stereotypical image of Texas for most people, right? The cowboy hat, the cowboy boots, the big open spaces. This is James Dean in his starring role in the movie Giant, which is also a movie about oil and real estate and the impact of newfound, nouveau riche money on a family out in West Texas. For the architecture crowd, it was actually filmed in Marfa. So if you've been out to Marfa, this is one of those kind of hallowed images of West Texas. But it's also, I think, one of those things that gives us an image of what that idea of Texas is about that's really not necessarily quite true, right? And especially in the post-war decades, the city really began to take over the image of what Texas was about more than the countryside, more than the open spaces of West Texas.
You know, that's flickering. I might try changing computer.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
I don't know if it's the computer or what it is.
The image that I'm showing you here is an example of what this kind of different image of Texas is about that begins to emerge, that still has that cowboy in it, right? He's sitting on the horse is rearing up in the air, but behind him in the background there's a rocket. And that rocket is a symbol for this aerospace industry that has its home in Texas just as much as the oil industry and cowboys had their home in Texas.
Do I have to, I'm going to move your flash drive. Do I have to do
Yeah.
Do I have to do escape? Or?
Yeah, let's just shut this just to be sure. That should be fine.
I just literally got this computer. No, it's not the C drive.
No, it's not showing up. There we go.
This one?
Yep. Perfect. Thank you. I shouldn't have been saying bad things about technology, right? All right, so we're back to the cowboy and the rocket, right? And to me, this is the story of Texas in the past, 30 to 40 years or so. Is this kind of fundamental conflict between this identity of the range and the cowboy and the free open spaces and the independence, and then at the same time, this extremely high-tech, cutting-edge piece of Texas as well. Dallas was home to Texas Instruments. Texas Instruments is actually where the transistor that's being advertised here in this kind of cowboy and rocket image was created. The transistor is the key to miniaturization of components, and it's the thing that first gave us the pocket calculator. So if you've ever wondered why if you get a calculator, you're still getting Texas Instruments calculators, they're the ones who miniaturized components. They miniaturized components so that we could get the Minuteman rocket. They miniaturized components so that we could get computers and personal computers. NASA has headquartered in Houston, a huge amount of the aerospace industry. Having the oil industry in Texas also meant that the development of extremely high-tech equipment and technology in ways that really contradicts the idea of a horse, right? Of a horse galloping across the plains. And this conflict is also very much a part of what makes cities like Dallas and Fort Worth and Houston really interesting places to study. So the context for this moment that David Dillon was writing about really traces its roots back to 1963 and the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas in November of that year. This great national tragedy had a lot of effects, but in the city of Dallas in particular, there was one thing that really stuck. And Dallas became a city that was branded with the name of the city of hate, because the city itself was associated with the assassination and was blamed as being the place that actually killed the president. There are a huge number of oral histories that the Sixth Floor Museum, the museum that was established in Dallas to commemorate and begin to understand the assassination, the museum collected oral histories with people who lived in Dallas during the assassination and talked to them about their experience of especially the 15 or 20 years after the assassination. They would say things like, oh yeah, I was in a cab in New York and my driver asked me where I was from, and I said I was from Dallas, and they slammed on the brakes, threw open the door, and said, get out. You killed the president. Right? And this is not just one person. This was everywhere. And in headlines around the world, Dallas suddenly made the front page, and it was for killing the president. And this slogan, this branding of City of Hate, stuck with the city. And it immediately made city leaders think about what needed to change. How do we change this public association with our city? And I'm showing you here Mayor Eric Johnson, who in 1964, 1965 began a very deliberate set of planning processes that resulted in the book that you see here, and a whole series of books actually that were called Goals for Dallas. These Goals for Dallas deliberately brought together architects, planners, educators, politicians, medical workers, every single person that you could think of as having a role to play in the making of a city, to have a conversation about what to do to make Dallas a different place. Johnson had been CEO of Texas Instruments. That was not an accident that mayors in Dallas come from the corporate world. And this very corporate approach to trying to think about how you set a series of goals that will remake the city really began in the 1960s. One of the most immediate effects and one of the key tools that they attempted to use in Goals for Dallas was architecture and planning. And in this kind of quote from the introduction, they are visualizing a Dallas of tomorrow as a beautiful, clean, safe, efficient place, a great, vital, growing area, always striving for excellence and renewing itself. We must conquer the hostile parts of our environment and expand and improve the friendly ones. And again, it was architecture and urban renewal that were the keys to that process. And I'm showing you just an image here from 1977, Dallas Morning News, in which the entire southern end of the city is under construction from, let's see if I have a pointer here that I've lost track of, all the way from, I think you can see over on the right, it says New City Hall. This band all the way around the bottom half of the city is a new city hall, a new convention center, a new basketball arena, a new hotel, a huge amount of planning and big scale projects begins to happen in the 1970s. And a lot of these projects are remaking the visual, physical image of the city of Dallas. One of the first is the Hyatt Hotel and Reunion Tower. This tower here on the right that's often called the Dandelion because it's got this stalk with a ball on top. It completely remade the skyline, turned the skyline that you see there on the left, which is a little bit like someplace like Amarillo, but not very distinctive, and turns it into someplace that's much more modern and up to date. There's a new city hall that's constructed in 1966. This is Mayor Eric Johnson in the center talking to I.M. Pei as Pei reveals the model for the new city hall for the city of Dallas in 1966. It takes a while to get this thing built, and it doesn't open until 1978. But the process for this new city hall that rebrands Dallas as a futuristic, modern city rather than an old, regressive one begins with Johnson in the 1960s. And there's that finished building, one of the most remarkable buildings in Dallas. But building these things wasn't easy, right? Just because the mayor and a bunch of other people set out some goals for Dallas and said that new cutting-edge architecture is going to help us look progressive to the world, it didn't make it easy. And there were huge debates about what things should look like and who should be hired. This is Pei talking to members of the City Arts Commission in the 1970s as they were trying to install the sculpture that you see there on the right. This is a Henry Moore that's called the Dallas Piece. And members of the Arts Commission didn't want it. They thought it was ugly and abstract. Other members of the patron class did want it because other cities have a Henry Moore. We want one too. And let's show everybody that we can have the same things they do, right? And this kind of back and forth really happens. That's the stage in which David Dillon starts to write for the Dallas Morning News. And in 1980, right, just as all of this building is happening through the 70s, he writes an article for D Magazine, which is the city magazine of Dallas, called Why is Dallas Architecture So Bad? People who are around in 1980 are still talking about this article. It makes people very upset still. It made a huge splash. And I won't go through everything that was in there. It's in the book. It's one of the two pieces in the book that aren't from the Dallas Morning News. But he writes this piece in 1980. And essentially, he's calling to task all of the developers who are responsible for all this new building, this huge new campaign of remaking the city. And he's telling them their architecture isn't good enough. Right? It's bland, it's boring, and most importantly, it's killing public space, it's killing the street, it's not creating a thriving civic and public life for the city of Dallas. He does a couple of things that are important. Number one, he provides some examples of things that he thinks are good, right? So that it's not just a critique, it's a, hey, do this instead. And he actually encourages city leaders in Dallas to look to Houston, which that's a real insult to everyone right there. And he encourages them also to look to Minneapolis, and cities that are doing some other interesting things at the time. The other thing that he does that I think is really important is he specifically calls developers to task and says, developers, you need to get an education. Look at other developers who are doing a good job. And he specifically here points to Harry Hines in Houston as a developer who's an actual patron of architecture rather than someone who's just trying to pay the least they possibly can and cut architects out of the equation. Those are two things that have long-lasting impacts, this kind of comparative approach and the focus on developers as a key piece of the puzzle, especially in cities like Dallas, Atlanta, Miami, Sunbelt cities where developers control everything. And I'm just giving you one example here from the paper. This is an article from just a few years later. The article comes out in D Magazine in 1980. In 1981, the Dallas Morning News hires him to begin writing an architecture column based on the conversations that came out of that D Magazine column. And writing specifically about developers, Harlan Crow is one of the biggest developers in North Texas. And the development company that he runs is still around and still developing all over the place around Dallas and Fort Worth today. And this was an article in which he spent a lot of time with Harlan Crow, lots and lots of conversations. And the title of the article, The Education of Harlan Crow, is accurate, right? These conversations were about trying to get a developer to change, to think about new possibilities if you change the way that you were thinking about the potential of design. And so in the book, what I did was essentially go through these articles to try to think about recurring themes. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I do want to emphasize that when we think of architecture criticism, I think we often think about like the thumbs up, thumbs down, like good building, bad building kind of thing. That's not what an architecture critic who writes for a paper for 25 years really does. These articles were about the city. They were about big issues in urban development. They were about planning. They were about culture. They were about much more than just the finished building and whether it was good or not. They were about process, right? They're about how things get done, who the people are, what the meetings are, what the elements are that actually mean that you can change a city as radically as a place like Dallas and Fort Worth have both changed within the space of 25 years. So I'll just go through a few of these. And a few of them, I think, are some of the themes that are particularly important for the era of postmodernism, the era of development in cities in the 80s and in the 90s, when there is a particular focus on bringing people back downtown. The city of Dallas is not the only city in the United States that had an almost completely empty downtown by the 1970s and 1980s as white flight and suburbanization had moved people away from the core of the city. The image I'm showing you here is a planning document from Downtown Dallas Incorporated that was created about 1980, and you can see here it's got the core labeled in the center and has a series of districts around that core that Downtown Dallas Incorporated was trying to invent. These districts did not exist at all. In fact, some of them, they're not named this anymore because these were completely made-up names in a lot of cases. But they were trying to think about what do we do to reinvigorate the downtown. And across 25 years, David's writing kind of shows what those strategies were, shows which ones worked, shows which ones didn't. I think for me, the thing that's particularly interesting is he very clearly identified what some of those downtown redevelopment strategies were from the 70s. Those strategies focused on big things, right? Make a convention center for your downtown. Make a basketball arena for your downtown. Make a festival or an event for your downtown. That's going to reinvent downtown. This he was not a fan of. And in fact, this basketball arena that was built in 1980 was torn down in 2009. It didn't last very long. Those big gestures were the things that he saw fail over and over again across many different cities. And again, that comparative element was a part of the writing. And the kinds of things that were more interesting were small-scale things that focused on pedestrians and that focused on bringing residents back to downtown. And I'm showing you here one attempt in Dallas. This is the Akron Street Pedestrian Mall. While this is the type of project that was a little bit more interesting, this pedestrian mall actually failed. No one ever walked down the street. It's going through its third or fourth kind of reincarnation right now. This time AT&T is paying for it because their corporate headquarters is here. And they're creating the Downtown Discovery District, which is the Times Square of Dallas. So we'll see how that one works when it's finished later this year. He also wrote not just about the core, the center of Dallas, and he wrote a number of those articles about Fort Worth as well. He also wrote about the metropolitan landscape, and this is that big, sprawling mess of Dallas, Fort Worth. Arlington, where I teach, is right halfway in between the two. There are more than 200 separately incorporated cities that make up the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area. It's very, very complicated. And in David's writing, he didn't just talk about Dallas. He talks about all of it. Because that's how this big, complicated, sprawling metropolis actually works. People live far away, and they commute. And they go through 20, 25 cities on their commute every day. This metropolitan landscape and his kind of love for the freeway and hate for the freeway at the same time, which you see kind of coming back in multiple articles, is, I think, a little bit more related to someone like Rayner Banham, who I'm showing you here. And Rayner Banham loves Los Angeles, that great film and project that he worked on, in which the first thing that Rayner Banham does when he gets to LA and he wants to show you the cities, he gets in the car and you're off, right? And the freedom of the car is a key to Dallas itself, and you also can't see it without one. There's literally no other way of getting around. The other kind of connective tissue besides the highway for Dallas and Fort Worth is the river. And the Trinity River is potentially connective tissue for the entire region. I'm showing you there on the left, this is the watershed for the Trinity River in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There are 4 forks of the river, from the Clear Fork on the bottom, the West Fork, and then the Elm Fork and the East Fork. In Fort Worth, the Clear Fork and the West Fork come together. One more fork comes into the river. The Elm Fork joins in the city of Dallas, and as the river moves past the city of Dallas, that last fork, the East Fork, comes together to make the river. So all through the entire area of the Metroplex, as Dallas-Fort Worth is often called, there is this water flowing through. However, if you look at the photograph on the top, that's what the Trinity River looks like in Dallas. It's a tiny little trickle of a stream, unless it's actually flooding, in which case it's an enormous torrent of water. The image on the bottom is one artist's projection of what the Trinity could look like if we just designed it to be a park. In this case, the project was for a lake, with this very large placid lake with people kayaking. There are other images of the Trinity River that have been suggested ever since the first city plan for Dallas that was published in 1911 by George Kessler. Over and over and over and over again, the region has talked about replanting the city around the river. And there's another plan right now that's also not been started being implemented. That's a Van Valkenburg plan for the Trinity River. Right? This kind of focus on thinking about what the positives and negatives are for the planning of the river through the Metroplex, and then dealing explicitly with issues of sprawl and what that really means when you have places as varied as Grapevine and this historic 19th century Main Street. And this is the town that's right next to DFW Airport. So next time you stop at the airport, this is what's right outside of it, even if it doesn't seem like that's what would be there. And about 10 miles further west, you get to Solana, where IBM's corporate campus was designed and located. What does it mean to have a place where sprawl mixes all of these typologies and time periods and scales together? And how do you begin to create any kind of sense of identity out of it? That's a huge theme in the work as well. If you ask people in Dallas what their favorite article is, and one of the things that I did because I didn't know David was I put together a group of about 8 people that I would meet with every 2 or 3 months or so to talk about the articles I was selecting and what their favorite articles were. Every single person mentioned this article. This article is called Big Mess on the Prairie. And in it, David identified what we would now call a McMansion. He called it the North Dallas Special. And he and the paper's illustrator came up with this really wonderful satirical image of what this North Dallas Special McMansion was really about, with the fake keystone, the Palladian window, 3-part window, the pilasters over there on the left, flat column for keeping up appearances. This multiple gables, as in House of the Seven, right? Let's see, eaves beneath which things drop, right? And so there are all of these kind of punning, satirical uses of language, and also this kind of attempt as well to suggest, again, to developers that they could do better, right? That this kind of drag and drop approach to architecture, which clearly comes from doing this on a computer, and when you can make as many different gables as you want just by plugging them in anywhere, that maybe we could do better than this. I think this one is a great example as well because it's funny, right? And I think that's one of the things that was really a key to the work is that there's a tremendous amount of humor that runs through it. Other themes that run through, and anyone who writes about architecture for the daily newspaper is always going to deal with historic preservation. Historic preservation is probably the thing that gets the people most riled up because it's what do we tear down and what do we save? People go to a public meeting to try to keep something that they love very much. In the Dallas Morning News, in Dallas in particular, there's not a huge preservation culture. And so writing about historic preservation has a different kind of quality in the context of the city of Dallas. This is actually Trammell Crow, Harlan Crow's family house being torn down. This was a house that was lost. This is by Howard Meyer, probably the greatest modernist practitioner in Dallas, one of the top modernists in Texas, probably number 2 after O'Neill Ford, who we'll see in just a minute. And this is the Zale house. If you've ever heard of Zale's Jewelers, this is the Zale house. So this was a tragic loss that was described in the paper, but there were victories as well. The preservation of Fair Park, the kind of largest concentration of streamlined, modern, and Art Deco architecture in the United States. Traces its roots to the 1880s, but has its kind of apex for the 1936 Texas Centennial Exposition. Is one of the really remarkable landscapes of Dallas. This was the administration building for the Texas Exposition in 1936, and it was transformed into the Women's Museum at Fair Park, which also didn't last very long. Wendy Evans Joseph was the architect for its restoration and reopening. And the museum stayed open for about 10 years before it had to close its doors. And then the Hall of State is another really spectacular example of the modern architecture at Fair Park. He wrote about the establishment of historic districts, right? This is another success. This is the creation of the Fairmont Southside Historic District in Fort Worth. This is actually the largest historic district in the state of Texas. We like really big things. And it is a collection of working class houses, right? And so in a way, not terribly remarkable because it's ordinary, everyday houses, but actually really remarkable in the context of North Texas for saving over 800 houses in the context of this historic district. He wrote about issues surrounding the Juanita Craft Civil Rights House. Juanita Craft was the first African-American member of the city council in the city of Dallas. And when she died, she wanted her house to become a museum where the history of the civil rights movement in Dallas could be interpreted. It has been a long journey. This article was written in the 1980s, and I was just talking about the article the other day with the preservation architect who's just been hired to actually try to work on the house. And the ownership of the house, funding for the house, is still in exactly the same kind of state of upheaval that it was when David wrote about it 25 years ago. They did just get a grant that should help them move in the right direction. Other themes, and I'm emphasizing these because these are things that are not just about Dallas, but if you're writing about a particular city, these are the themes that are important everywhere. Who are the architects and the developers that make up that place? You know, the unique flavor of a city depends in large part on the architects who design its buildings. And David worked really hard to identify the designers who were the canon of Dallas and Fort Worth architecture and to make their names known, right? So that when someone buys a building by a David Williams on the bottom left there, Howard Meyer on the bottom right, that's O'Neill Ford up at the top right, or a Charles Dilbeck up at the top left. When someone buys a house or building by one of these architects, there's really no question that what you're going to do is restore it in some way. It's not that you buy a Charles Dilbeck to tear it down, although that's what people are still doing. You buy an O'Neill Ford to keep it. There is a great exhibit on Dilbeck at the moment up in Dallas that will hopefully help because his houses are torn down, it seems like monthly at this point. We just lost another O'Neill Ford house about 6 months ago. And so this establishment of a canon of names is incredibly important for every place. This is one of the earliest of what we think of as being a ranch house that develops in Texas by David Williams. This house is on the market. And there's some folks who really wish it would become a house museum, but everyone knows that will never happen in the city of Dallas. So there's a documentation project going on right now to try to document it. David Williams collaborated with Richard Neutra to create Avignon Village, this cooperative worker housing in Grand Prairie, just to the west of Dallas. This is O'Neill Ford's Bromberg House, which extends the development of that idea of the ranch house. Howard Meyer's Temple Emmanuel, which is one of the great modernist sacred spaces in Texas. And someone like Hal Thompson, who designed this incredible assortment of eclectic houses for the wealthy on the east side of Dallas. Art Deco architects like Lang and Witchell. There's no quiz. You don't have to know who all these architects are. But he extended that up into the present, and he began to support the work of contemporary practitioners as well, in trying to establish what is a Texas architecture, what is a Dallas architecture, and someone like Gary Cunningham and his design for the Cistercian chapel that used Texas limestone and cedar to create this really remarkable sacred space on the north side of Dallas, and an architect like Max Levy, who in a very subtle courtyard connected that covered space out into the pond beyond. The last kind of theme that I think is interesting for this time period, and that does connect also across the United States, is this focus on museums and arts districts. And anyone who's been to a museum recently knows that for the past 30 years or so, there's been this incredible explosion in museum building everywhere. We have new museums all over the place. I was talking to a friend who's an architect in New York, and she said, you know, what I really, really, really want more than anything is to make sure that I get to design a museum before I retire, right? Everybody gets to make a museum. And Texas had a bumper crop. And this was a big piece of what David wrote about. And I'm showing you examples of museums that popped up from the 80s forward in Marfa. This is Donald Judd's compound in Marfa. The San Angelo Museum out in West Texas. Rafael Meneo's design for just one piece of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which is added at least 3 or 4 more since then. And the first building renovated for the San Antonio Museum of Art that was done by Cambridge 7 in the 80s. This kind of bumper crop of museums in the context of Fort Worth and Dallas very much played into the creation of the cultural district in Fort Worth and the arts district in Dallas, in which there are multiple arts institutions brought together. Fort Worth has the cultural district because it has both cattle and art. So if you kind of go clockwise from the top left, that's Casa Mañana, a theater complex. To its right is the livestock and exposition show, the Will Rogers Memorial Coliseum, where the rodeo is held, as well as livestock exposition. So if you would like to look at cows, you can see them there. The National Cowgirl Hall of Fame, the Children's Science and History Museum, the Community Arts Center, the Amon Carter Museum of Western Arts, the Kimball Art Museum, the great Louis Kahn, and then Tadao Ando's Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. Right? That's quite a mix of institutions, right? From the Cowgirl Museum, which is a little bit kitschy and fun, to something that is really as sacred as Louis Kahn's Kimball Art Museum. Those things put together were a part of what David wrote about, and the lack of connective tissue, as well as, and I had to toss this in because the Kimball Museum in the 1980s contemplated expanding by basically adding some bays on the ends. So the Kimball as it exists now is in the center, and they decided, hey, why don't we just add some more on either side? This was hugely controversial and didn't happen. As well as the addition of the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth. In Dallas, the Arts District is even a bigger deal, and this goes back again to Goals for Dallas from 1966, which is how do we remake Dallas as a city of art rather than a city of hate. And by 1982, the plan that you see here at the top, that green quarter down the center is Flora Street. This is a master plan for the Arts District that was created by Sasaki. And this idea of placing a kind of band of art along the north side of downtown. This is the thing that David wrote about over and over and over and over again. There was no way to select enough of these articles to actually put in the book to give you a real sense for how this unfolded. From the beginning, this was controversial, the way that real estate speculation prevented the creation of a series of public institutions. There were hugely complicated issues in what it meant to actually turn a street like Flora Street, which you see here in 1983, with the Dallas Museum of Art, that arched building with a fountain in the front, the first anchor institution of the Arts District, finished in the early 1980s. And then you see the same street, the same view in 2017. Right, so you see that prism, that is the Pay Cobb & Freed's Fountain Place Tower, right there. And you're looking down the same street, which now has the Norman Foster Opera House. Across the street is the Wiley Theater. That's Rem Koolhaas, Ian Pay's Meyerson Symphony Center, Renzo Piano's Nasher Sculpture Center, and then the Edward Larrabee Barnes Dallas Museum of Art. This is this kind of amazing collection. Behind us is Booker T. Washington Performing Arts High School, and in a whole other series, there's an SOM theater on the other side of the street. I mean, it's just this remarkable collection of institutional buildings. All along the way, though, David wrote about this process as how much the land cost, how much the buildings cost, and where are the artists? right? There are no artists in the Arts District. It's just institutions, right? It's a symphony. It's an opera. It's the High Art Museum, but there were no artists. And if you look at this view here, how many people do you see walking around? Right? And that's a typical day in the Arts District. Right? There's really not many people there either, because you drive, this building has a parking garage in the basement. You drive, you go up into the building, you go back down into your car, and you leave. And so there was never a lot of pedestrian life in the district. So this is, I think, one of the most significant things that David wrote about was, please think about these institutions as being connected to each other. And there's a new master plan for the Arts District that is attempting to do exactly those things and bring in some artist housing, bring in people, bring in ways of getting people onto the street in between performances. And this is where I think we get some of the most interesting writing that is that thumbs up, thumbs down critique of architecture. Some really wonderful writing about Pei's design for the Meyerson Symphony Center, which is just a fabulous, wonderful building. Some really terrific writing about the Nasher Sculpture Center and its materiality and the technology here. We're looking from Lorenzo Piano's back porch for the Nasher Sculpture Center into the Peter Walker Garden. And then also about small projects. And this is the last point that I wanted to make also, is that an architecture critic is obviously going to write about the new Symphony Center when it's finished. But there are lots of other things that happen in cities as well. And David paid attention to the small things also. And I think this is what made him a really good critic for the city of Dallas. It wasn't just the big stuff, it was the little stuff. And he absolutely supported, the quote that you see here is completely on target. He supported innovative small places, plans that recognize that cities and towns develop slowly and incrementally. The big bang one-shot solution dies hard everywhere. I'm showing you a photograph that was taken by Willis Winters, who's director of the Dallas Park Department. He's retiring right now, actually. I think today is his retirement party. And it's a photograph that he took of one of a series of park pavilions that are scattered all throughout the city of Dallas. Basically, every public park, Willis Winters decided needed not just the pavilion you order out of a catalog and gets shipped and you pop it down, but actually a well-designed, beautiful, thoughtful, creative pavilion that could help define that neighborhood distinctively and differently than another one. This is Opportunity Park Pavilion, designed by Rand Elliott from Oklahoma City, and it's this beautiful, just folded, very simple piece of origami that really looks like a butterfly. And I'm not going to show you all of them because they're great. We should look at all of them. I'll show you one more. This is Wendy Evans Joseph's Park Pavilion for the Webb Chapel Park, which is up in North Dallas, near where the tornado went through yesterday. And again, it's just a very simple structure that provides shade. In this case, concrete with this really wonderful yellow painted underside, which the sun shines through, and is this brilliant, sunny, rosy space underneath. And there are more than 24 of these things, all by different architects scattered throughout the city. And I think this is some of the best stuff that Dallas has actually built, more so than the Arts District. And I think what you get when you have an architecture critic writing for the paper is a way to call attention to these small things that people might not ordinarily know about. It's tremendously important to have someone sensitive both to how difficult it is to get these kinds of things done and to the quality that you get when you have designers actually working on something that seems like, yeah, we should just get that plastic bench out of the catalog. No, right? What is the difference that good design makes to a city? That's what I think the importance is of architecture criticism everywhere, not just in Dallas. And it's part of the lesson that I think we can learn by reading this collection of articles about Dallas, even if you live in Massachusetts, is that this is a time period in the 1980s that's typified by postmodernism, the 80s and the 90s. But it's postmodernism not just in terms of architecture, but it's postmodernism in terms of the way that cities work and these big scale solutions and the primacy of developers and emphasis on wanting to do projects that are going to instantly change a city's image overnight. Okay? And when you read David's writing across time, what you find is that those are the projects you need someone keeping an eye on and holding accountable. But really what you want to know about is the other stuff, right? The other stuff that's happening at the same time. And his writing, I think, gives us a really good picture of the processes that actually make cities good places to live. Thank you very much. Sure, and if anyone has a question, I'm happy to answer any questions. UT Press, you go to the UT Press website, and I have some postcards, I can hand it to you, and it's on Amazon. I mean, it's wherever fine books are sold. Yes.
Wherever fine books are sold.
Other questions? Yeah.
This is maybe a big question, but I'm curious if the sort of tenor of his writing changed over the 30 years. What sort of observations you have?
Yes. So I think one of the things that I see change in the writing is from the early writing to the late writing. The level of confidence obviously changes. He knows the city really, really, really well by the end, and I think that's the other piece of value in having someone write for a long time. Is by the end of that 25 years, he wasn't just writing about architecture. The paper was doing these big series on the future of Dallas, right? There's a new city plan called Forward Dallas, and he was participating with the education editor and other editors and subject areas of the paper to actually set editorial policy, right? And so it's not just the architecture critic. He's on the front page. He's on the editorial page. He's writing on the city and its politics. That's I think the biggest arc that I see is someone who read the work rather than actually saw it unfold in real time.
Yes, I'm kind of curious so you showed a number of well-known books by well-known architecture critics. So when did architecture critics first appear on the scene?
On the scene. So Montgomery Schuyler is 1870s and 1880s in the U.S., and he's really what we think of as the first American architecture critic. There's, architecture publications start in the U.S. in the 1870s. There are a lot of unsigned articles. But it was Schuyler who was really the first who started saying, I'm Montgomery Schuyler. Here's my opinion, and you want to know what I think about buildings in New York. Mariana Van Rensselaer starts a little bit later, and she also has an identifiable voice and signs her articles. But her book on H.H. Richardson is very influential, but she's also writing more about landscapes and gardens in some ways than about architecture.
I might get in trouble for this comment, but since you know David's taste peripherally, and he was on the planning board in Amherst, wasn't he? Design review in Amherst. I would like you tomorrow, if you don't have time, to just drive through our little downtown. And if we could recreate, David's spirit. I just don't want to be around when you give us your opinion, because it's a curiosity, because I think our town, is the opposite. It used to be a walking town, and now it's not. I feel like I'm in downtown Minnesota all the time with these new buildings, so I don't want to prejudice you, but...
I would definitely... there's nothing as important as local architecture, and I probably didn't say that clearly enough, but it's actually local architecture that I think matters. And I teach at an architecture school, and we talk about New York all the time, even though we're in Dallas, and really we should probably be talking even not just about Dallas, but about Arlington, because it's the places that are surround you that are always the most important, and we don't spend enough time thinking about out-of-the-way places.
I think that's a really interesting point, because much of the development in downtown, I assume you're talking about Amherst.
Yeah.
Okay. Happened after David passed away, and I myself wonder, what would David think? Yeah. So that's a question I often ask, is what would David think about? And I really don't know what I don't know it.
I don't think he'd like it.
It's funny, I was on a panel in Dallas in June, and someone asked at the end, they said, we've got all of these scooters in downtown Dallas. What do you think David would think of them? I had literally no idea. I don't know.
You'd like pedestrians.
Other questions? Yeah.
Who are among today's more notable or famous architectural critics?
So a lot of the same people. So Paul Goldberger is still writing. Michael Kimmelman is writing for the New York Times. Mark Lamster has taken over at the Dallas Morning News. Inga Saffron is writing in Philadelphia. John King is in San Francisco. Blair Kamen is still writing in Chicago. It's a lot of the same folks. There are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer people writing at newspapers. And that's pretty much, I think I just named everyone. I probably left someone out, but there's not that.
Robert Campbell
in Boston. There are not very many. There were, I think, more. There was someone in Minneapolis that was half art, half architecture that I don't think is there anymore. There used to be someone who read every now and then in New Orleans. Now in New Orleans, there's someone who writes a little bit more of a cityscapes, like a Christopher Gray type column for New Orleans. There's not a lot of newspaper writing, and I actually fundamentally think that newspaper writing is incredibly important. And I know we have a lot of websites like Curbed and DZine and other places. They don't seem to fulfill the same purpose because people don't write for as long a time period and they're not as locally focused.
I was going to ask if you could see through the research, the sort of attitudes of ordinary people changing over the course of all this work and for these years of advocating for better architecture.
So I think that's a really good question, right? And I think every critic kind of wonders, and maybe Sally might have a insight into this too. Every critic wonders, like, what is the impact that they have? And in some ways, you kind of have to hang your hat up and say it's going to be relatively limited in some ways. And the hope is for that impact to be on the people who make the decisions, right? To the people who can actually make things happen. I think that there is greater public awareness in Dallas for sure than there would be without. But it's also really, really big. And I also wanted to say the Dallas Morning News, no one in Fort Worth reads the Dallas Morning News. I mean, like, no one. Huge civic rivalry. And the Star-Telegram has never had anyone write about architecture. And there's much less knowledge in Fort Worth than there is in Dallas, running in both circles. And in between in Arlington, or say up in Plano, or south in some place like Burleson, that there's no conversation. And so while the conversation that's been shaped about the Arts District has, I think, been really important, and the conversation that David shaped about the Trinity River, those have been incredibly important. Like, the whole city of Dallas-Fort Worth is just, it's just this amorphous, who even knows what is going on in all those places.
Actually, you know what, we'll go there and there.
My question was, so you mentioned that people in North Dallas kind of gathered a lot of people, like all different elements of architecture and landscape architecture. And I was wondering if you knew how closely those people work together throughout the process. Because from my understanding, they tend to be kind of disjointed.
Yeah. So you're asking about the Goals for Dallas process? So it was I think the issue that I see with the way the Goals for Dallas unfolded is that it was a small number of people. So from the architecture realm, there were about 3 or 4 people. There were not very many planners in Dallas at the time, so there weren't really very many planners. Architects were filling the planning role, which has its own issues. And the groups, while they came together to present their reports, they tended to split back up when they went off and did their studies. And so while people met each other, and I'm speaking as a historian here, not as a member of the Goals for Dallas group, my perception is that the groups didn't intermingle their methodologies or subjects as much as you would want if you were doing this now. I think for the 60s in Dallas, it was pretty innovative, but the results of the Goals for Dallas were not really particularly remarkable. I think that if you sat down and just wrote some goals for a city, they'd be pretty similar to Dallas's goals. Actually, like better public education, an improved downtown core, more people downtown, better traffic, all of these things were kind of the same. I think that the difference with Goals for Dallas was the attempt to create a more transparent and open process that the public could see and participate in, even if that didn't quite come true.
Thank you for this lecture. It's been insightful and wonderful. It's a beautiful book. I'm curious about your quote from David in the beginning that architecture's biggest ally is a concerned public, and you kind of extend that to educated public. That now with the kind of ability for everybody to comment via social media, right? That we all have an opinion and we can put that opinion out there. That presents challenges to criticism, right? But also might give voice to kind of underrepresented or marginalized communities in a way. So, what is the role of criticism in this new kind of social media sharing, kind of distribution of critique and information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I probably don't really have an actual answer for that because I think we're still in the process of figuring that out. In a way, I have no idea. But I will say one thing, which is that social media obviously allows people to say anything they want, for better or for worse. But the role of kind of officially recognized platforms continues to be pretty strong as well, even if it's different. Writing for the New York Times is pretty important. Like your opinion matters more than someone else's opinion still in some way. And so, in writing for having a platform from which to express your opinion automatically makes your opinion matter more than someone else's. What that means in the context of social media is that critics, in a way, can see what people think of what they say more quickly, potentially. But I also know that, has anyone ever been to a public meeting about a building or a planning decision? Right? Like, there's a lot of there's people who have opinions. And those meetings remain probably fundamentally still exactly the same as they were in some ways. You can maybe anticipate some of the comments more easily because you see what someone posted on Facebook before you go. But in a way, I mean, social media does change things, but in a way, I'm also not sure how. Does that? A little bit, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
Another lecturer here pointed out that people are using Google Review and TripAdvisor as sort of a forum for architectural critique.
Yeah.
So I actually looked, and there's 2 Google reviews of this building. Like, it's just the same way that they'd be reviewing a restaurant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about what the Dillon Center does?
Sure.
And in what ways people use it?
Yes. So as director of the Dillon Center, the mission of the center is to connect conversations that are happening in the School of Architecture at UT Arlington with public conversations about architecture. So the kind of conversations that David would have kind of sparked in architecture circles, the university and our architecture students and planning students need to be a part of that conversation as well, but so that they can really understand what it's like to be in the public realm. The way that we do that is we do it through public events. We have a Dillon Symposium every 1 or 2 years. We have one coming up in 2 weeks, actually, that I'm doing in partnership with the African American Museum of Dallas and BC Workshop, which is a nonprofit community design group, to look into the history of freedmen's towns across Dallas-Fort Worth and neighborhood advocates who want to advocate for their both historic preservation and their redevelopment. The point of that conversation is to bring residents, architects, historians, and everyone in between together into one conversation to actually think about what can be done. How do we leverage filmmakers and artists to help tell stories of these tremendously important communities that we don't understand? I think that's one thing that we do is through those kind of public conversations. The other things that we do is we do publication. So things like the book that I always say that if you go to the library and you look at the New York shelf, it's super big. And if you go to the Dallas part, it's like that. Right. So the idea is to do more research on Texas and Texas architecture and make the bookshelf a little bit bigger across time.
What's the bookshelf? No, I'm just kidding. So thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.